Hello, my name is Charles Hopkins, and I'm bringing you wishes for a great day from a very snowy Toronto. I so wish I was there with you in Lima. It's been a number of years since I've been there and working with our colleagues at the Regional Center of Expertise in ESD that's located at Ricardo Palma University. But others that have been there within the Ministry of Education and the Rectors Association and so on. It would be a much nicer place to be. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this International Congress on the Humanities. I took some time with the topic, and I'd like to share my screen and put up a few of the slides that I've put together. Now, today I was invited to speak about the roles of education for sustainable development, and not exclusively, but sort of highlighting higher education and also the role of local government and non-government organizations in the search for a more sustainable future. Now, let's begin with looking at some of the risks and the issues that are actually facing humanity at this point. And the World Economic Forum, they each year sort of put together what they see as the big issues, the wicked global issues that are out there. And then they try to rank them or cluster them with what are some of the real issues. And in this chart, they put the center is sort of the most important ones. I chose this because this was done in 2019, just going into 2020. So COVID was just emerging as they brought it in. So what they chose, if it was at the center in the highlight, was a green diamond, green being environmental, and it being climate action failure, not addressing climate change hard enough. Some of the others that are there, you have orange colors, blue colors, some are social issues, economic issues, and so on. And then out on the edge, you have the infectious diseases. Now, I must say, the next year, both infectious diseases and climate change action were together as identified as not only the ones that most likely to happen, but the ones with the greatest impact. Right? So the idea then is, how do we address this in the collective? And the idea that has been around since the 1980s is that collectively, as nations, we tried to have a sort of a global policy of sustainable development. Right? Sustainable development meaning development that not only addresses the needs of today's generation, but the future. The grand challenge of how do we address today's needs? How can we have people all over the world thriving equitably, but at the same time ensure that future generations will have enough resources and that we'll have air, water, and so on, as well as non-renewable resources for them to thrive. So that is the grand challenge, and the answer that we've come up with is sustainable development. Now, I think it's important to know that now we're sort of looking at the current implementation plan. It's called the 2030 Agenda, but it's the third in the series. While the concept of sustainable development was ratified by nations all over the world in 1987, they took 5 years to come up with the first implementation plan. That was called Agenda 21, and it ran from 1992 through to 2000. Then we come up with the second one. It was called the Millennium Development Goals. I'm sure many of you sort of remember that, but it was only targeted at a handful of the really poorest, least developed nations, and it was limited to 8 targets. Education, though, being one of them. The goal was to have everyone reach at least grade 6, around the world. So this is the third one, and this is another 15-year plan, like the Millennium Development Goals that ran from 2000 to 2014. This one plans to run from 2015 to 2029. Thing to keep in mind is that there will be a 4th implementation plan. So the idea is to keep your eye on the concept that we are seeking a sustainable future, and that the Sustainable Development Goals is the implementation plan. Okay. Now, when we look at it, you'll see that these are 17 issues that world leaders could agree upon. They're not necessarily the 17 biggest issues. They are huge, but they're the 17 biggest issues world leaders could agree upon what we are going to do. Because as well as the 17 goals, each one of them has targets behind them. In fact, there's a total of 169 different targets represented here. You'll see that number 4 is one on education. One of the things to consider is that the way in which they are presented, it looks like 17 independent or compartments. I love the previous way in which the World Economic Forum showed these as all interwoven, connected, complex. If you pull the string on one, it's going to work on the others, and so on. So it's important when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals that we look at them almost like a patchwork quilt. The idea you have the different patches, but unless you treat it as a whole, then it's not going to keep you warm. Right? Now, if we look a little further into Sustainable Development Goal 4, you'll see their targets. They have 7 targets, and you can see the first one is moving on from the Millennium Development Goals with primary education. Now we want everyone to have secondary education. 4.3 addresses post-secondary education, equal and affordable quality, technical, vocational, and tertiary education. 4.5 addresses the gender disparities. It looks at those who we least well serve in our education systems, Indigenous, and the vulnerable, right? 4.7 is the one that is different and is referred to as education for sustainable development. There are 4 aspects of education for sustainable development. So to try and understand it, we're not calling it adding a new discipline or a new faculty or any. We're looking at it as a purpose of our overarching education systems. Okay. So when we were working on this, I happened to be one of the authors between 1987 and 1992. There were 10 of us from different parts of the world looking into the concept of education for sustainable development. And the first thing that we came up with was the need for access and retention in a quality education. Each country could come up with what their definition and aspects of what is a quality education. But we realized that unless you had a very educated public, you wouldn't have development. So we needed to have that basic education. The second thing, though, was realizing that it was our most educated countries that were creating some of the deepest ecological footprints and created some of the greatest injustices. Right? And so the idea was not to have everyone just pursue what sort of a Northern or Western education system, but to reorient their education systems, changing the purpose from straight development and enhancing economic flow and gross domestic product, to reorient, to focus on sustainable development as an outcome of our education systems. The third aspect, which is also extremely important, is realizing that we need to have the general public, citizens at large, to understand sustainability, to want to embrace it, so that they will elect politicians who are suggesting enlightened policies and so on. Right? We need to have that kind of engagement, not only as a citizen, but as a consumer, right? As a producer in their workplace, to live their lives in that particular way. And then the fourth one was training, where we do know how to do things better, ensure that everyone is trained in that particular manner. Now, it is important, though, to understand that education for sustainable development is more than just this part of Sustainable Development Goal 4. Yes, it is extremely important. And if you look at 4.7 fleshed out, it says that by 2030, ensure all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development through education for sustainable development, which would affect sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, and so on, and also some through global citizenship, which gives them the skills, the idea of education for sustainable development, giving the knowledge and so on to act, but global citizenship to encourage them to actually become engaged. But the United Nations General Assembly has gone beyond Sustainable Development Goal 4, and on 3 occasions, they have identified education for sustainable development as the key integral element to enable the implementation of all the Sustainable Development Goals. It calls upon higher education, for instance, to engage with research in different goals, whether it's on land, the oceans, or gender equity, and so on. Each of these requires research, and it requires higher education engaging with their graduates. Okay? Higher education around the world is crucial. So few people proportionately graduate from universities, but that small number, they will become the majority of shapers of the future of the world. They'll not only become our politicians, they will be the heads of business and industry. They'll lead faith-based groups or religious institutions, right? They'll be our poets, our painters, our dreamers, our philosophers. Right? These are the people. So there's a tremendous responsibility for higher education in assuming that responsibility of shaping those who in turn will shape the future. Now, it's not only another sort of imposition on universities. It can be a symbiotic relationship. The goals and the targets and how we work, both of education for sustainable development and the universities themselves. We focus on research, we focus on teaching and learning, we focus on community service, we focus on using our campuses as living laboratories, as modeling what we talk about. And so if we look at the contribution of higher education, yes, it contributes greatly to sustainable development through teaching, research, community service, and so on. But what we get back from this, universities that pursue sustainable development, they will get opportunities for research. They will get funding, yes, but they will get relevance. They will get meaningfulness in the eyes of the students and appreciation of being engaged and involved in something realistic. But to get this engagement, okay, one of the things that is needed is working with universities and cities and local government and so on, and NGOs in collaboration in order to take these high sustainable development goals that the UN has identified, but also to translate these into local issues, right? So if we take the social, environmental, and economic issues and translate them into local reality, so that people can actually become engaged, involved, and contribute and make a change. Simply being aware of global issues that you can't do anything about is depressing and is not helpful. Right? So what we need to do is to translate these into actions that we can work on. And that is the role of the regional centers of expertise, as well as people, just whether you're a member of that or not. But that is the concept behind it. How can we bring together two groups? The group that do the teaching and passing on of information, the training, public awareness campaigns, and those that have accurate information on what are the sustainability issues facing the community now and what is coming. What do we see in projections around transportation, around air quality, around housing, around poverty, the migration into the cities, and so on? What do we see, and what can we be doing to either prevent, to mitigate, to reduce the impact, or to adapt? To start now saying, this is what it's going to be like. How can we do that? And how can we create the ingenious new ways of doing it, such as on the right, the idea of using ski lifts to bring local public transportation to communities built in favelas and so on. Now, one last thing is the idea of using the Sustainable Development Goals as research frameworks. So that in this case, with COVID in the middle, you can see how each of the goals has a relationship or something to do. This reinforces the idea of the multidisciplinary, the transdisciplinary approaches that we are needing, whether it's at the university to understand something through research, or whether it is action in the community. The different NGOs and municipal groups and universities and so on that need to come together to work, to bring their expertise and to share it. Whether it's what do our graduates know, or how do we serve our communities better, whether it's the local community or the global community and so on. It's an opportunity to really become innovative and to take a lead. I love this, the Daniela Tilbury's line of saying, it's time for higher education to shift from being mirrors of society, sort of reproducing what is already there, towards becoming lighthouses of a sustainable future. Now, UNESCO has come up with their own sort of parallel plan on the role of education in parallel to the 2030 agenda. They have the 2030 roadmap, ESD for 2030. Okay? And they have identified 5 areas. Number 1 is advancing policy. How can we come up with enlightened policy? Whether it is the Association of University Rectors looking at policy for all the universities, or down to each individual one. Right? How can we shape Ministry of Education's policy through knowledge and so on? How can we transform our learning environment, whether it's schools or universities and so on, to model what we're talking about? How can we provide professional development for our educators themselves and so on? Empowering youth and engaging them in meaningful action as citizens, right? And lastly, how can we at the local level, using municipal governments and other actors, how can we speed up the transformation into becoming more sustainable communities? Lastly, I'd like to mention both the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, that sort of works with the most developed countries, as well as UNESCO, are coming together in a unified way of saying it's not just about math and language, right? Even OECD, the father of PISA scores, right, are saying, yes, math, language, science are extremely important, but they're tools. They're not the purpose of education, right? So we're saying, yes, we need these tools to be as sharp as we can possibly have them, but we need to focus larger on the whole child, right? The goal is this well-being by 2030, the well-being not only of people, but the well-being of the planet, right? So we need to focus not only on knowledge, but skills, values, attitudes, perspectives. All of this is important. And what UNESCO, on the right, on the left is the OECD Learning Compass that spreads all the way from preschool through to university and lifelong learning. On the right is what UNESCO is saying. Yes, we need knowledge and information. And we need people to be aware of what are the realities. We need to give them skills of critical analysis and so on. But number 4, this is new. The idea of introducing compassion into school systems. It's the engagement. How do we move from head and hands to actual heart so that people will become engaged? It's one thing to know, but it's something else to act. We all know what we should be eating and our diets and so on. We all know about exercise, but what do we do? So the idea of how do we actually become engaged and have the skills for informed action and knowledge. So I hope this is helpful. And I also hope that the next time I see you in Lima. So thank you very, very much for the opportunity to be with you. And I wish you all the very, very best for the Congress. Thank you.